In 1974, as Mazinger Z was finishing up its run and starting its own legacy, another robot was coming into the scene. Super robots at that point had consisted of Mazinger Z and Great Mazinger and, at least in animation, little else. Ken Ishikawa set out to change that. The Japanese cinemascape was being affected severely by the economic crunch that occurred in the mid-70s, which led to shrinking budgets for most of the live-action heroes that everyone had gotten relatively used to. Godzilla vs. Megalon was a prime example of this, though it was originally slated only to feature Jet Jaguar. Jet Jaguar himself was originally known as Red Alone and was designed by an elementary school student to be an amalgamation of Ultraman and Mazinger Z. He also bore superficial resemblance to another mechanical hero, Spectre-Man, who fared well enough in the States. Sadly, neither of these mechanoid heroes had much staying power beyond their initial releases. Worse yet for that orange and gray bucket of bolts, the film itself was weak from the outset, and the film was heavy on recut footage, as it also featured Gigan, a cyborg monster that resembled a chicken crossed with a blender. It was not a pretty sight. Godzilla's next foray into kaiju combat fared much better. Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla boasted some of the more interesting monster fights and a more intricate narrative. And Mechagodzilla himself became a staple of the series, spawning several revamps as the series progressed. He was so popular that he got to have a whole nother film to wreak havoc on. Unfortunately, as luck would have it, lightning failed to strike twice. Terror of Mechagodzilla would end up being the nail in the coffin of the Godzilla films for nearly a decade. If you wanted a giant monster beatdown, however, there were plenty of TV shows to choose from. There was always Kamen Rider and there was always Ultraman, but there was also shows like Fireman, Green Man, Zone Fighter, and Jumborg Ace, which, not to put too fine a point on it, all seemed to be the same show. And again, they weren't so much giant robot shows as really big dude shows. However, one did stand out, in much the same vein as Giant Robo. Super Robot Red Baron crushed his way onto TV screens in 1973, and while he didn't have quite the longevity of his animated cousins, he still spun off an extra TV show and an animated series in 1994. He, like our next subject, shared a lot of similarities with Mazinger Z, but then so did most robots at the time. With the ending of Mazinger Z and subsequent beginning of Great Mazinger, there was pretty much nothing else on the back burner for TV animation studios to develop quickly into a series. Tetsujin, Tetsuwan Atom, and Mazinger Z had stories already well in hand when they were put to sell. Luckily, there was someone who had the chops to get another contender on the air. Ken Ishikawa had started work on Getter Robo with Go Nagai in 1972, and the influence is quite clear in the first series, simply titled Getter Robo. The character design choices, the overall tone of the anime, and the cast itself is very much in Nagai's wheelhouse. The parallels with Mazinger Z are fairly easy to see. However, there was a very important difference between them that would, without exaggeration, change the face of the genre forever. While Mazinger Z's piled or hovercraft could combine with the machine to make it work, like a brain being put into a skull, the Getter machines were modular jets that combined into 3 different modes for air, land, and sea combat. Getter 1 was helmed by Ryoma Nagare, a brash martial artist in the most recognizable form. Hayato Jin, an aloof loner, took the reins of Getter 2. Musashi Tomoe, a lively, if dim-witted judo master, handled Getter 3. Michiru Saotome, the doctor's daughter, also ran recon for them in the command machine and recharged their Getter rays when the chips were down. However, when the manga began publication several days after the anime aired, the difference between Mazinger Z and Getter Robo became much more apparent. The characterizations were all darker and much more violent. Characters were prone to bursts of extreme violence and rage, even in a comedic setting. While the base story elements were maintained, the manga took a much, much darker path. Not that the TV series was all sunshine and sparkles either. The Getter team was always intended to fight the Dinosaur Empire, which sent biomechanical beasts to fight the heroes. Unlike the mechanical monsters of Mazinger Z, which were clearly machines, the Dinosaur Empire's Mechasaurs were precisely that. Though they sported metal armor or mechanical parts, they bled and splattered a lot more than anything Mazinger Z ever put to pasture. Luckily, when they exploded, they didn't leave too big of a mess. And it's a good thing the pilots weren't on the cleanup crew, because they spent as much time fighting each other as they did the bad guys. As often happens with very strong personalities, they clashed over just about anything, from Michiru's affections, which none of them ever won, to who gets to pilot what ship. This made it much more palatable as a drama show, though it wasn't particularly deep. The Getter machine, starting with Getter 1, was well equipped with a pair of tomahawks from either shoulder, which looked more like gnarled clubs with a big blade on the end than a proper tomahawk. It could also be thrown like a boomerang just in case the target in question needed to be extra dead. The second form, sporting one of the most important influences on Mecha, the drill weapon, was the speediest of all the Getter forms. It could move it up to Mach 3 and use its drill as both an offensive weapon and as a tool to create tornadoes to finish off its enemies. The final form, Getter 3, relied entirely on throwing its opponent around in a judo hold, much like its pilot would do. However, the most impressive weapon in any of the forms was the Getter Beam, which was a concentrated blast of Getter Ray energy. Getter Rays are the Getter Robo world's nuclear radiation, and function for the most part like photonic energy in Mazinger Z. Getter Rays are abundant in the universe, and wherever there are Getter Rays, it's possible for Getter Robo to travel. Getter Rays work roughly the same way that radiation worked in early superhero comics in the West, and they were able to do fairly well anything. However, they carried much less risk than the nuclear power that proliferated in comic books. Later on in the reboots and sequel series, towards the end of the century, the Getter Rays are nuclear rays implication got much more pronounced, but in the early days it was kind of only hinted at. One immediately obvious thing is where all the design work went for these machines. Getter 1, being the lead machine, has the most iconic and well-balanced aspects of the design, where Getter 2, while still having interesting aspects, looks less like a war machine and more like a child's sketch. Getter 3 looks more like a half-finished transformer, even though that series wouldn't come to be for another 6 years. There was a definite concern for how the pieces slotted together for Getter 1, and where all the fancy weaponry and Getter Wing fit in. But by the time Getter 3 was designed, clearly it was just a matter of pushing it out the door. This particular design hiccup would be rectified in later outings, but Getter 1 was always the handsome one, with the other two being derpy cousins. Getter Robo G had a much more solid sense of design. Once the Dinosaur Empire was finally defeated, though not without heavy cost, the next iteration of Getter Robo was brought online with Getter Robo G. Admittedly a ploy at the time to sell toys and model kits, the unit itself was much more fully realized, fighting in the three forms as usual. They took on the Hyaki Empire, a race of Oni who, much the same as the Dinosaur Empire, were hell-bent on taking over the surface world. Once this finished airing, that would be the last that Getter Robo would be on the air until 1991 with Getter Robo Go. Getter Robo Go was actually planned to be a Mazinger Z reboot, but they changed it to better suit the complexity of the narrative. The original Getter Robo got a new lease on life with Getter Robo Armageddon in 1998, which pushed the narrative to its illogical conclusions, to great success. The retro style was much loved by appreciative fans, though when it was brought stateside it suffered from a lack of background information. Shin Getter Robo vs. Neo Getter Robo went live in 2000, an amalgam of all the stories and characters to date, and finally, New Getter Robo was released in 2004, a complete retelling of the original story. This would be the last time that Ken Ishikawa would work on a Getter series, as he died soon after in 2006. The Getter series continues to influence shows left, right, and center, and its most notable contribution is the combining archetype, followed closely by the drill. So here you have it, Getter Robo and its successor, Getter Robo G. So now the die was cast. All sorts of pretenders suddenly sprang up out of the woodwork, and next time we'll take a look at the super robot boom of the late 70s.